Attachments.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I wish to read to you ZESNI's preliminary statement following the elections that took place yesterday. You bear with me. It is slightly long because it is covering a number of issues that we were looking at in this election. As part of its comprehensive efforts to observe the 2018 harmonized election, the Zimbabwe Election Support Network trained and deployed over 6,500 observers to every ward, constituency, district, and provinces of the country. This preliminary statement is based on reports from a statistical sample of 750 polling stations to provide truly representative information on the conduct of voting and counting in near real time. As of this morning, 739 of the 750 of these observers had reported in. And I understand that in the last few minutes, we are now at 100%. Today, ZESNI is releasing its preliminary findings on voting and counting processes as observed on election day. ZESNI is not making a final determination about the conduct of the 2018 harmonized elections yet. The elections are not yet over, and the results tabulation process is still underway. ZESNI continues to observe the processes and will do so throughout its conclusion. ZESNI would like to emphasize that its observations are based on the entire electoral cycle, which entails observing all electoral processes in the pre-election, election day, and post-election phases. Therefore, ZESNI's overall assessment of the 2018 harmonized elections will be based on the entire electoral cycle and not just election day. In the pre-election context, ZESN observed the biometric voter registration process in which 2012 accredited observers were deployed to observe this exercise. In addition, ZESN also deployed long-term observers in all 210 constituencies to observe key electoral processes in the run-up to the elections, such as inspection of the voters' roll, the provision of voters' roll, the nomination court processes, campaigns, and the general pre-election environment. Furthermore, ZESN conducted an audit of the voters' roll. I want to consider the political environment. The Zimbabwe Election Support Network found that the political environment was largely calm and peaceful. The ruling and opposition political parties were able to campaign freely across the country, with the MDC and ZANU-PF holding the majority of rallies during the campaign period. However, a bombing incident occurred at the ZANU-PF rally at White City Stadium on the 26th of June 2018, at which 2 people were killed, and this is very regrettable. ZESN also received widespread reports of people being asked to submit serial numbers on their voter registration slips during the biometric voter registration exercise, and this undermined public confidence in the secrecy of the vote. In addition, some candidates continued to campaign during this cooling off period. In terms of the civic and voter education, as a way voter during the PV. I want to talk. We acknowledge the role the traditional leaders play in preserving our culture and being the custodians of our traditional values. However, certain long-term observers reported incidents of traditional leaders openly canvassing support for the ruling party, and in some instances forcing people to attend ZANU-PF campaign rallies. This was mainly enforced through threats that food aid will be stopped and support for local projects will be withdrawn. 2018 harmonized election took place under the constitution adopted in 2013. An important reform is the change from a ward-based voters roll to a polling station-based voters roll, which makes multiple voting more difficult. However, Zesn's legal analysis notes that the Electoral Act is yet to be fully harmonized with the Constitution. In particular, while the Constitution in Section 67 provides for the right to vote for every citizen, in respect of the 2018 harmonized elections, the right was not extended to those in prisons, hospitals, and those in the diaspora. Further, the role of the Minister of Justice and Legal and Parliamentary Affairs in the operations and decisions of ZEC impedes on the independence of the Commission. In terms of the biometric voter registration, as per recommendations from the previous elections, ZESN welcomed the transference of the custody of the voters' roll from the Office of the Registrar General to ZEC. This was accompanied by the introduction of the BVR registration exercise, which has produced a biometric voter roll, and the polling station-based voter registration system. Thus, the ZEC complied with a new voters roll under the new polling station-based system, using the BVR system amid renewed hope of a new, current, accurate, and comprehensive voters roll. The decision to employ BVR for the 2000 harmonized election introduced two important changes. First, it resulted in scrapping the discredited 2013 voters roll, thereby eliminating deceased voters and inaccurate information about existing registrants. Zesn's analysis shows that approximately 2.7 million registrants on the 2013 preliminary voters roll are not on the 2018 voters roll initially released by ZEC. Secondly, the collection of biometric information such as photographs and fingerprints would have made it easier to remove duplicate registrants from the voters roll and to prevent voter impersonation on election day. There were lower registration figures in Bulawayo and Harare in the four phases of the BVR Blitz, representing 34% of unregistered voters, showing signs of apathy. During the mop-up exercise, ZEC allocated significantly more BVR kits to the rural areas where there were high registration, and only allocated 88% of the BVR kits to these metropolitan provinces, which had earlier on only registered fewer compared to the rural provinces. And this, in our view, is regrettable. In terms of the voters' roll itself, ZESN conducted an audit of the voters' roll availed by ZEC to parties and observers on the 18th of June 2018 and found it to be an improvement over the 2013 preliminary voters' roll. The ZESN audit revealed lower registration rates for urban and young voters compared to the rural and older voters. The registration rate for rural areas was 83%, while for urban areas it was 72%. Similarly, for registrants aged between 18 and 32, the registration rate was at 59%, while for registrants 13 years and older, the registration rate was at 100%. Sorry, 33. I would take that again. For registrants 33 and older, the registration rate was at 100%. The ZEC failed to release the preliminary voters' roll or the exclusion list, making it impossible to assess the deduplication process. However, the actual final voters' roll was only shared on the 25th of July 2018, when it was too late for proper analysis to be done on the roll. Moreover, that roll that was shared on the 25th of July 2018 again missed other attributes, such as the photograph of the voter. In terms of the confidence on the work of the election management body, we note that Justice Priscilla Chigumba was appointed chair of ZEC on 1 February 2018. This noted initial positive engagements between ZEC and various electoral stakeholders, but these were gradually warned as the election day drew closer. Concerns remain about the independence of ZEC amid executive interference in key electoral processes such as the Observer Accreditation Committee and the Logistics Committee. Concerns were raised by electoral stakeholders with regard to the design, printing, and dispatch of the ballot papers, which was done without consultation. The ZEC did not permit meaningful observation of the production of the ballot papers and did not allow for testing of the indelible ink. Insufficient clarity was provided before election day on the results tabulation procedures. In general, ZEC did not communicate effectively with stakeholders and the public, especially information that was conveyed through social media. The Constitution of Zimbabwe, in line with the regional and international best practices on gender issues, mandates states to promote gender balance in all spheres of life. However, the Electoral Act is silent on the matter of women being equally represented in political spheres. ZESN noted that for the 2018 harmonized elections, none of the contesting political parties attained a 50-50 representation between males and females for the National Assembly elections. In fact, 91% and 90% of the candidates of the major contesting parties, namely ZANU-PF and the MDC respectively, are male. There were 1,648 candidates vying for the National Assembly, and only 237 of them are women. And one does in this election. So we are likely to see an even lower number of representation of women in the National House of Assembly. There was hate language on social media, especially targeting female candidates and officials. And perhaps it is one of the issues that resulted in a very insignificant number of women candidates in this election. Coming to the media environment, the elections are being held at a time the Constitution provides for freedom of expression and freedom of the media in terms of Section 61 of the Constitution. The media has been relatively free to operate without any hindrance. However, the media fell short of fair, equitable, and balanced coverage of political players, as this largely favored established political parties, particularly ZANU-PF. The nature of the coverage was largely disadvantaged less established political parties who have not managed to get much media attention and have failed to take up any offered advertising space to market their political parties. 53% of the coverage in the election period was on ZANU-PF, with 76% in the state-controlled print media and 48% of it on SABC. While these challenges and concerns have been noted, there has been no observable attempt by ZEC to ensure that the media adheres to provisions of the Electoral Act and other regulations that provide for free, equitable, and balanced coverage, despite the existence of a media monitoring committee. In terms of state resources, ZES and long-term observers reported a significant number of incidents of ZANU-PF officials using state resources for campaign purposes. The most frequent types of abuse were the distribution of food or agricultural inputs, the use of government vehicles and planes, and facilities for campaigning. We also witnessed government officials sometimes speaking at the campaign events of ZANU-PF. I want to now move on to focus on election day. At 99% of the polling stations, polling officers were present when ZESNO observers arrived, and 97% of the polling stations opened by 7:15 a.m. 32 of the assembled polling stations had 10 polling officers, 24% at 9, 26% at 8, and 16% at 7 or fewer polling officers. The average number of election officials at polling stations was at 9, of which 5 were women. In addition, 36% of the polling stations had a female presiding officer. 100% of the polling stations had all the essential polling materials such as ballot boxes, voting booths, ballot papers, ZEC stamp, the exclusion list, and the voters' roll with photographs, though a few polling stations, about 1%, were missing at some stage indelible ink for marking fingers. At 100% of the polling stations, ZANU-PF party agents were present. 95% of the polling stations had an MDC Alliance party agent present, while the People's Rainbow Coalition Party had party agents present at 38% of the polling stations. In addition, 60% of the polling stations had party agents from other political parties or for independent candidates present. 90% of the polling stations were set up in a manner, 98% of the polling stations were set up in a manner that allowed voters to mark their ballot papers in secret. Reports have also indicated that 91% of the polling stations where ZESTIN observers were easily accessible to everyone, including persons with physical disabilities. In addition, at 100% of the polling stations, the ballot boxes were shown to be empty before being closed and sealed. The average number of registered voters per polling station was 564, and the average number of ballot papers issued per polling station was 512. And in terms of voting, at 100% of the polling stations, all voters' names were checked against the voters' roll, and fingers were checked for indelible ink before being permitted to vote. At 84% of the polling stations, all voters had a finger marked with indelible ink before voting. At 100% of the polling stations, all presidential ballot papers were stamped with the ZEC stamp before being issued. At 6% of the polling stations, many people, that is a figure of 26 or more, were turned away and not permitted to vote. This was by far most common in Harare, where at 19% of the polling stations, many people were turned away and not permitted to vote. At 45% of polling stations, many people were assisted to vote, 26 or more. For Manicaland, Mashonaland Central, Maswingo, Matabeleland North, and the Matabeleland South provinces, the percentage of polling stations with many assisted voters was over 50%. At 39% of polling stations, most assisted voters were aided by a person of their choosing, while at 58% of the polling stations, most assisted voters were aided by the presiding officer. For Blueyo, Harare, Mashonaland West, Matabeleland North, Matabeleland South, at less than 30% of the polling stations were most assisted voters aided by a person of their choosing. In the press statement that we share with you, we have graphs that speak to those issues. At 3% of the polling stations, there was campaigning nearby and unauthorized persons were present in the polling station. At 2% of the polling stations, there were incidents of intimidation, harassment, or violence, of which half targeted women. Similarly, at 2% of the polling stations, someone attempted to disrupt voting. At 97% of the polling stations, disabled persons, the elderly, and pregnant or women nursing were allowed to go to the front of the queue and vote without waiting. At 95% of polling stations, everyone in the queue at 7 p.m. was given an opportunity to vote. However, the time taken to process voters was adversely affected by poor lighting in a significant number of polling stations. And I think that is just shown again in this room, where half of the room is suddenly experiencing the same. In terms of counting, ZESTIN observers were permitted to observe counting at 100% of polling stations. At 99% of polling stations, the seals on the presidential ballot boxes were intact when counting commenced. At 3% of polling stations, an MDC party agent requested a recount of the presidential ballot paper, while at 2% of polling stations, a ZANU-PF party agent requested such a recount. At 97% and 99% of polling stations respectively, MDC Alliance party agents at 90% of polling stations, all party agents present were given a copy of the presidential results form. At most polling stations, the presidential results were posted immediately after counting finished. Presidential results were posted less frequently for Bulawayo and Matabele North Province than any other provinces. And again, there is a graph that gives that spread across the country. In conclusion, based on reports from Zimbabwe Election Support Network observers, turnout for the 2008 harmonized elections will perhaps be over 70%. And this in part due to a new voters' roll that eliminated deceased and ineligible persons, as well as enthusiasm on the part of the voters. ZESN commends the people of Zimbabwe for turning out in their large numbers to exercise their democratic right to vote. As noted, the tabulation of results is currently underway, and ZESN continues to observe this process. ZESN encourages the ZEC to release polling station results in a timely manner to increase transparency and enhance confidence in the tabulation and collation processes. As appropriate, ZESN will issue additional statements on the process, including on the tabulation of results. We call upon all Zimbabweans to remain calm as elections results are being announced. I thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll now open for questions. You may raise your hand. Yes, I'll start with you. Anyone else?
Thank you, sir. Andrew Harding from BBC. In your report, in your written report here, I see that you say 79% of polling stations saw the presidential results posted immediately after counting finished. But when you were speaking just then, you said at most they were printed or published. Is that because statistics are changing? You've got an update, or it's just, I'm curious why you didn't read that bit out. It's obviously 21%. I've heard from the MDC they're concerned about that, extremely concerned.
Just to clarify, which report is that?
We don't have any report which is out at the moment. This is the first public preliminary statement on our observations.
I have a copy.